What's up, Sales Hacker community? Welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. My name is Scott Barker, Head of Partnerships at Sales Hacker. So we've got a great topic to chat about today. So the topic is how to win more deals with sales engagement data. Now, before I introduce my guest, I want to take care of just a few housekeeping matters. So we will be recording this session. It'll be available afterwards in case you need to jump off or you want to share it out with a colleague. As you know, we love our webinars to be interactive. So with this in mind, please feel free to go to the chat feature, introduce yourself, name, title, company. Our panelists definitely want to hear from you. I want to hear from you, so please ask questions as we go. For this webinar, we will be fielding relevant questions throughout, and then if we have time, we'll have a little Q&A session at the end. So now that we have that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guest presenter. I'm joined by Michael Schultz, VP of Sales and Marketing at ClearSlide. Michael, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. So, Michael, you've had an impressive sales and marketing career working at really big, massive organizations like Accenture, Microsoft, AOL. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this topic with you, getting to pick your brain a little bit. And, it's the start of a new year. So I think we can all use some tips on how to win more deals in 2018. But without further ado, Michael, do you want to kick us off?
I would love to. Thanks for the introduction as well. I think we are at a critical moment in sales and marketing. And the world is changing. There's been a lot of talk about death of a salesman. We're seeing a much more investment in sales technologies, much more investment in particularly in sales people being really successful. But I think we're also seeing a lot of concerns going into 2018. And this is coming from a variety of different sources that really talk about some of the challenges that leaders are facing. And they're not really surprising. New revenue growth, overall sales productivity, forecast accuracy. When you look year over year, these are largely have been the same. What's been really interesting to see is the movement around what it takes to be successful, which is everything below the box. So much more focus on the customers, faster deal cycles, onboarding. Those are some of the items that are becoming more of a concern over time. But again, it hasn't really changed all that much. New revenue, sales, productivity, and forecast accuracy. I mentioned up front sort of we're kind of an interesting time, which is that despite all the investment in technology, we are seeing some of the lowest achievement levels from sales organizations. This is a chart from the Miller Heiman Group, formerly CSO Insights, that really look at both revenue plan attainment and sales teams making quota. And again, we're at the lowest level, 53%, and we're ever seen. And we actually think that there's a reason for that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the session today. But it really starts with how people are spending their time. I think that we have a thesis and a hypothesis where people are a little bit overwhelmed. Some of the, with the new technologies coming on board, whether it's kind of automation of the process, even stretching to AI, there's so much of it and there's less time being spent managing effectively, that salespeople are spending a lot of their time on non-selling activity, and it's a real challenge.
This is crazy. So 65% of salespeople, their time is spent on non-selling activity. That's a crazy stat. If you did that in any other industry or form of work, that would be a massive problem.
Yeah.
But so where do you think this comes from? Too much distraction, from tools? Is it lack of formalized process, or is there something else?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think we're going to cover some of that as we go through the session today. But I do think that the primary one is that there's an expectation that everything is logged and captured, from auto logging outreach to customers to needing things for forecast and pipelines. There's a lot of expectations being put on the frontline seller and even the frontline marketer to be able to capture more than ever before, because the data that itself is so critical. But a lot of this is still new. People are overwhelmed with the set of tools. It's all not connected together. And so consequently, salespeople are spending a ton of time on things related to tracking and capturing things, but not necessarily customer focused. And I think that's where we're going to see some of the biggest shift in the next couple of years is how do you maximize your time in front of the customers? So we talked, in the previous chart, it was productivity and revenue attainment. Customer sat is becoming a critical element. When you take a look at research that's been done around customers and how well they feel like they're being served, it actually correlates pretty well to the salesperson not spending time on selling, is that they don't feel like they're being serviced correctly. And so again, this is a massive area that we'll see a shift on in the coming couple of years.
Absolutely.
So let me get into some of the tips. I'm going to cover 3 areas that are really around kind of a new way to think about sales performance, and that's using something that we're calling engagement data. And engagement data is really a proxy for time spent with customers. It's the amount of time that teams are spending interacting with customers, generally around things like sharing content, having meetings, whether those are online or in person, because a lot of the selling today is really done much more online. Customers are generally 2/3, if not almost 3/4 of the way through the selling process before they ever interact with a sales team. And I think being able to really leverage things like engagement data should really help. So I'm going to cover 3 core areas around that, and I'm hopefully we'll get some real good dialogue going. The way that each of these kind of quote-unquote tips work is I'm going to cover some of the challenges that are being faced in these areas, and then offer some really interesting kind of ways that companies are using or engagement data and some of the best practices that they're using to really help achieve some of these objectives. So the first one is using engagement data to qualify and forecast deals, which is clearly one of those top priorities. Given everything I said up front, this probably isn't the biggest surprise, but 58% of forecasted deals slip out of the quarter, right? So, real big one.
Yeah, I think we've, as sales folks can relate to this one. We've all had this happen. I'm sure people had forecasts for Q4 in December that are now slipping out into January. And it's always a pain point, right? Like, I think sales reps fully believe that they're going to close too. So as a sales leader, how are some ways you can prevent this from happening?
Yeah, hopefully I think some of the discussion we'll have today could spark some ideas and inspiration around that. I think it's a couple of core things. I think the first is that I think we're not doing as much diligence early on in the sales cycle to really qualify opportunities. And I think it's because it's super confusing. Again, as I said, customers are most of the way down the sales process, and they're coming at it from a kind of whatever stage that they're at, and yet a lot of organizations have still very traditional sales processes in place. And so I think it's kind of hard to know. I think there's also less sales leaders in place, just in terms of the coverage ratio, to be able to coach and mentor and develop. And I think it's kind of that plus a number of other factors that are just making it harder to stay on top of these things. And I think that's why it's using additional measures like engagement data can help as a way to give another way to look at the data. I think in addition to sort of the things slipping, I think this kind of goes along with that, which is that 75% of deals in the pipelines never close. And that shouldn't be. I think it gets worse and worse maybe as we go on. But I think that what we're seeing is that people aren't quickly qualifying and then closing things out. And if you kind of take a look at this is something that came from our friends at Miller Heiman, but if you take a look at craps in Vegas, looking at some of the numbers, you have a higher odds of winning craps than you do forecasting deals accurately. And so there's got to be a better way. And I think a little bit to your question to your question, I think a lot of it stems from not validating interest early enough in the sales cycle. I think that we let people get a little bit too far along, or we don't know exactly the points that they're coming in, and so 70% of reps are not validating interest early enough.
Wow. So not only are they not fully qualifying, but not even really checking for like the main pulse, which is like the interest, the need. That's going to really push everything forward. Question: how do ClearSlide's reps measure interest?
Yeah. So I just before I answer that, I think you're spot on, which is that I think what I've seen across a number of different of our customers is, they affectionately, people use a variety of different things in their sales process to identify whether someone's interested or not. Bant is kind of a good example of that. And I think that what we see is people sometimes moving away from that. So I think part of it's getting back up to basis. But for ClearSlide, I think that one other measure that we put on top is taking a look at engagement data. It's taking a look at how much investment of time are people spending engaging with a sales team, how much time is spent engaging with content, and it's a real good measure of we think of success. And I think part of the reason why that's so important is that leaders are kind of lack confidence in their own activity data, and we'll talk in a slide or two just about a new way to look at it. But this to me was one of the most striking stats, is that most leaders have actually no confidence. And I think we all know kind of how that process works today. You come into a forecast meeting, maybe you're putting it in a CRM system or not. People talk about their forecast, but then there's another management forecast and a haircut that goes on. And I think that people are looking for another way to have a lot more confidence in their data. And there's a lot of great technology out there that's starting to try to make this a lot simpler by looking at past performance. So a few best practices just to think about, and kind of around the theme of buyer engagement. I think one of the things that we found is by looking at either the number of engagement or the time spent engaging, it gives a real good way to qualify opportunities faster. So kind of as a quick example, if you think about sales cadence campaigns, prospecting campaigns, about getting people to identify interest, I think what we're seeing is that people are getting much more refined by focusing on the people who are engaging as a way to move those deals forward versus kind of a spaghetti on the wall approach. So really interesting stuff going on there. I think the other is that part of what goes into validating interest is not that someone just responded to an email or clicked through, but you can actually take a look at these days what people are responding to. ClearSlide, and there's some other tools out there as well that give very good slide-by-slide views of how people are engaging. And so when you do the follow-up, you actually have a much better sense of what was actually interesting, because they either spent more time, they may have forwarded things along, and you've got much better telemetry. So again, validating, really using the engagement data at a very detailed level. And then I think one of the more, yeah, go ahead.
Michael, just to backtrack there just really quickly, so when we're defining buyer engagement, then that would be kind of an aggregate of how much time they've spent with us on the phone, how many emails that they're opening, how many times they've opened it, how many times they've seen the collateral or perhaps shared the collateral out. Anything else I'm missing there on buyer engagement and how you're defining it?
No, I think that's spot on, and I think that each organization, they've got to find the right thing to them depending on the kind of organization they are. I think for us, what we see in a more what I call B2B environment, I think it really is for us really three things. It tends to be what we sort of call the number of meetings. Meetings kind of as a broad term around online meetings, in-person meetings, which is kind of a measure of are you connecting with your customers on a regular basis, and then it's engagement time, and then what we sort of call number of interactions. And so it's sort of the total interactions across some of the measures that you talk about. And I think that you're spot on that this is a different way to look at how well you're progressing. And just because someone opened up an email is not a good proxy for are they interested. It's got to be one level deeper.
Totally, I agree.
Cool. Yeah, and it was a great point. I think to take that one step further, I think that what we are seeing, and whether this happens in products or whether we see a lot of organizations doing this in BI tools, which is what they're starting to do is take a look at their pipeline and then bringing in engagement and other measures to weight their pipelines in a different way. And I'll give an example in just a slide here that shows kind of how that difference plays itself out. This happens to be on the slide here, more of a visual representation of kind of quadratizing the data, where I can kind of map engagement time against size of deal and very quickly understand what I need to go focus on. And so to kind of give an example for kind of how that kind of works, I would say that in the interest of kind of hiding the companies, this is somewhat of a scripted scenario, but it's some of the deal size information is actually real, but we sanitized it. So this is kind of a typical forecast. People run their forecast different way. This has stages and it has rep probability. Again, people may do it a little bit differently, but it's a pretty good example of, hey, I've got a $4 million pipeline. I'm only looking at deals that are at sort of 50% kind of self-rated or above, and I kind of get to a weighted forecast of just about 3.4 million. So pretty standard. What would normally happen is the manager would come in, put a haircut on top of that. But then when you take a look at what actually happened, and so if you look at real won-loss data, you can see that the probability didn't really matter all that much. It was a lot of it. Sometimes it's a hope and a prayer, and it's much more about kind of gut feel in a lot of ways. We actually did some work with the Sales Enablement Society around kind of how were people kind of rating forecasting. Was it based on fact or was it based on gut? And what you found is that 75% of the forecasting was done with at least some level of gut feel, and actually 0% of organizations was fully based on facts. And so this kind of gives you some sense that we're not always perfect at forecasting. This kind of goes to that 50% of deals being lost. If you take a look at engagement data, it kind of gives a different view. What I've done is take the same exact data and kind of ranked it around total engagement time, and then also you kind of get a sense of the number of interactions that are going on. You can see there's a wide variety. And if you kind of think about your own business and how you think about forecasting deals, I see a lot of this when we talk to customers. They'll say, I know this deal is going to close. And you take a look at their engagement or their number of interactions, and they say, yeah, but that's not a real good measure because, I have a really good relationship. We text all the time. But what you find at the end of the day is those results kind of bear themselves out. So this is the same data ranked by engagement time. And if we take a look at just the deals, and I took an arbitrary 3,000 engagement minutes or above, and that somewhat correlates to somewhere above 15 or 18 kind of interactions. And I take a look at that, I end up with only about a 9% error rate versus about a 30% prior. And so it's not perfect, but being able to have a really detailed conversation deal by deal and talk about, well, how are you engaging? How many meetings have you had? What have they looked at? I think becomes a very powerful way to put an alternative view on how you can get to accurate forecast.
Absolutely, that's great. It kind of it takes the think and the feel out of selling. When you utilize this engagement data, and I think if you're ever saying to your sales manager or your sales VP, I think this is going to close, or I feel this is going to close, I think you should take a deeper dive into that deal because in modern selling, you can't be going off of those gut feelings anymore.
Yeah, cool, great. Yeah, totally agree. There's a kind of the second practical tip is all about content. I think that one of the reasons why we see I think in some ways a lack of performance, it may seem like a kind of a small area, but it ends up being really impactful for companies, is having a single source of truth for content. And let me kind of show some of the challenges. 74% of organizations don't manage sales content effectively. I kind of mentioned some work we did with Sales Enablement Society. We did a quick survey in a room. We had about 100 people, and we said, how many of you have a single source of truth for sales content? And a whole bunch of people raised their hand. And then you ask a follow-up question that said, well, how many libraries do you have? And the average was somewhere around 3 to 4. And it really means that we all think that we have this, but we really don't. And most people report that content is very difficult to find and use. If you ask any sales team, they tend to do that. And when you look at the numbers, 440 hours a year is the estimate that a sales rep spends searching for content. It roughly translates into about 20-ish% of their time. Massive number. Wow. And when they do find it, still more than half the time, they're creating their own collateral. So it's a pretty big challenge.
Yeah. And, when we have sales reps creating their own collateral, I've seen multiple nightmares of people using outdated, brochures or specs that are just going to cause, so many headaches down the line, right? So interesting fact.
Yeah, I think the other piece that I think you're just in your comment too is that it's having things up to date that's really critical. I think that what I've seen a lot of is people always believing they have to build their own. There's sort of this natural tendency, and I think that really a kind of a shift we're seeing is being able to have much more at your fingertips. And I'll kind of show some examples of that as we go forward here. I think that the other big trend that has been sort of both a trend and also a challenge is content on mobile devices. I think that there's this real opportunity for organizations to make sure that people always have access, to the content they need, as more and more people are having devices that are enabled to go do that. And so just a few best practices to think through. I know this one sounds quite obvious, but having a single source of truth for content. There's a lot of organizations that we talk to that say that they have a single source, but actually teams are confused about where to go. So the ability to have everything that's, call it sales ready or customer ready, all in one place, easy to find, make sure that I think there's a lot of trend towards contextualizing that content. So if you actually have a lot of information about the stage of an opportunity or the industry or the region, you should be able, I think there's an expectation today that content comes back to you much more tailored than it ever has before. But you can only do that if all the content is in one place. I think the other is simple to customize kind of approved content. I think you kind of alluded to that a little bit, is that things are always changing, but if you don't always know you have the right version of that, it can slow things down and cause complications. I think we see a lot of that in a lot of regulated industries where it has to be up to date. And I think what we see is a lot of people spending time building custom things that really don't have to be built. And this is kind of an example of how you can quickly assemble content assemble recommended content, but again, having that all in one place makes that possible. And then knowing what works and what doesn't. What I'm always continually amazed with is kind of the in some ways the conflict between sales and marketing around, hey, I gave you the best information possible, best content, and yet you get to see now in real time what customers are responding to. And so this slide sort of has an example of a kind of a standard presentation, and you can see which slides have been viewed by customers. And again, you have a much better sense for kind of what people are responding to, so you can really be consistent with your messages, but also know kind of what's working. So just kind of the last area is I think around coaching and onboarding. I think some of the trends in this area are a real challenge for organizations. I think companies are now realizing that how you get people onboarded and up to speed quickly becomes a real huge thing. So some of the challenges that we see based on some of the data is that sales turnover is 20%. When you actually put both voluntary and involuntary, the number is closer to 33%, which basically means for a lot of organizations, a third of the sales team is turning over every single year, and it's very problematic.
Yeah, definitely an unfortunate trend in sales right now, but definitely a reality, unfortunately, and it seems to grow year over year. So something that organizations need to be baking into their sales process. I think at the latest, average tenure is something like 19 months only.
Yeah.
So curious to hear your tips on how to ramp up reps.
Yeah. No, I think there's not a sales leader that, whether it's their first three objectives or not, it's not always thinking about how do I make sure I've got the best people on board. And I think that along with sort of the need to continually always be hiring, as they say, is that it's also taking a little bit more time to ramp. So 71% of organizations it takes 6 months or more to ramp new reps. And I think that the nuance in this particular number is that the area that actually is taking that is growing the fastest is actually where it's taking 9 months or more to ramp kind of more highly skilled roles. And so this is an area that I think everyone, certainly on the enablement side, is focused on, is how do I get people achieving quota a lot more quickly? And I think part of the challenge that we hear a lot of, and the research bears out, is that it's really difficult to spend time helping reps directly sell. The ratios between managers to reps, I think, it used to be the guidance used to be somewhere between 5 and 6 direct reports. So I think we've seen 7 to 8, and in a few organizations they'll go up to 10 or 11. And I think people are hoping that technology can help bridge the gap to make it a lot easier. But I still think that this is one of the critical ones that we hear organizations talk a lot about, is how do I alleviate some of the time that my managers are spending on some of those non-selling? How do I find ways to have them be a lot more productive? And so here's a few best practices I think that we see from organizations to help with doing that. I think the first is we call it a perfect pitch library. And it's not pitch perfect. All 3 movies were fantastic. But I
Should we do a rendition right now?
I think we may get people to jump off. So let's not do that. All joking aside, it's not that dissimilar in a way. I think that one of the real trends we've seen is that it used to be when you would onboard people, you'd kind of stripped out their training, and you'd ask people to go listen to things. And I think with ClearSlide and other solutions, I think the ability to take real calls or real interactions with customers, because you also want to hear the questions that are being asked and how people were able to handle certain things coming their way, makes the onboarding so much more relevant. So, hey, if I want to hear how people in financial services are, I'm moving into sell to that area, I should be able to hear relevant pitches from that particular industry, and I should be able to identify the best of the quote-unquote pitches that are out there. So when new reps come on board, that's what I'm being trained on, so it's a really interesting trend. The other that we see is this notion of sort of real time. The ability to learn from each other, I think, is happening a different way. When you talk to sales leaders about how they used to do it, it used to be you'd go out in the field and you'd spend a lot of time listening in on customer calls. In those settings, I think a lot more of that is actually happening online, and it's happening again in real time. And so having a system that allows you to very quickly follow the deals that matter or follow reps that matter, being able to see what they're using. Hey, this rep has amazing open rates with a template. Can I get access to that? Or, wow, this person's a fantastic rep. How can I make sure that I'm always staying on top of some of the things that they're using? So the ability to do things in real time helps. And I think the details matter. I think traditionally, it's been the leaders who have had access to all the called the leader dashboards, and I think there's been a lot of great trend in some of the gamification areas. But I think being able to have really good transparency around the metrics that matter. So, who's the top? Who has the most engagement? What customers are they speaking to? What content was being used? And making it all available for self-discovery can really be beneficial. And I think the last one is really around kind of using what we sort of call replay, but recordings for coaching. And I think that because of the constraints of time that folks have, the ability to not only be able to listen to a whole call, but be able to drill in slide by slide. So, for example, one of the things that we do that I do on a weekly basis is I can take a look at a particular slide. This happens to be a platform slide, and I can listen to 15 calls in a row of just that slide for all different sales reps. And I can hear how it's landing, the questions that are coming, and allows me to actually not only coach them, but also give good feedback to other organizations around what's working and what's not. And all this is available. It's again, whether it's ClearSlide or other tools and technologies, these are the kinds of things that you should be able to take advantage of kind of immediately. And I know there's probably a few questions, but just to kind of wrap up some of the tips as we think about a new way of looking at kind of sales performance. It's thinking about engagement data, the amount of time and interactions that are being spent versus gut feel as a way to prioritize and forecast. It's about thinking about ways for people to have the right content at their fingertips. They don't have to go search. So you always are on point as being really key. And then for coaching and onboarding, it's making resources available so I can see what others are doing, learn from other best practices, and having really those artifacts available for me to be able to analyze. And I think that some of these hopefully will be ideas and inspirations for people to be able to think about the way that they're running the teams in just a different way.
Love it. Those are great practical tips, and I think implementing those in any modern sales organization is gonna help a lot. So awesome. So we do have some questions. I know we're getting close to time here, Michael, but I think we'll field maybe one or two of these. Because there's some good ones here. So we've got one here from Chris, and it is, how can I encourage reps to fill out the necessary engagement data needed to make this work? Is it like a mandatory field, or how do you set that up?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question to be able to talk through. So I think it's the answer is kind of twofold. I think one is the way that we do it, and I think a lot of our customers do it, is that we kind of automate the collection of the engagement data. So you have the basics around email sent, open rates, numbers of meetings, what content's been shared, the engagement. But the second part is that we actually do mandate some things, and it's best practice that we share with our customers, which is we try to mandate the capturing of as much information at the right time. So kind of a good example of that is we call it a pitch recap, where at the end of an online meeting or an in-person meeting that you're running off your phone, you can mandate that a rep has to fill out certain information to be able to move forward, but it's done at the right time versus in arrears. The second is that we have a setting where you can kind of mandate that you can record phone calls that makes the capturing of this information easier, so I can go in and coach more effectively. But there is a little bit of a mandate that has to happen here, and then knowing kind of how you want to map it to the right fields in your CRM system.
Makes sense. So automate as much as you possibly can, and then just reach an agreement on the mandatory ones you want to fill out.
Absolutely.
And then I got another question here from Alexa. So have you ever used incentives for clean sales data for reps?
Yes, that's a great question as well. I think that one of the things that we find pretty exciting is some of the gamification that's happening, And I think that the way that we've seen it kind of play out is a little bit more in driving to the end result that you want versus kind of rewarding for data. I think the goal should be to automate. I think to your last comment, automate as much as you can, and then decide what you want to go mandate, and have that map in. I do see a lot of movement towards more on the forecasting side, is making sure that data is clean. I've seen people try to incent having clean data, but at the end of the day, it's much more about managing the performance versus trying to incent that. So if you're looking for clean pipeline data, it's just kind of telling your teams to make sure they're filling in the right information and then holding them accountable for doing things that are part of their job. But I do think that there's a lot of really interesting things around gamification that can actually help automate some of these ways to get better data.
Totally. Yeah, I think the real incentive for clean sales data is going to be a closed won deal for a rep, which is the be all end all. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I think that's our time, Michael. Just quickly before you go, you want to tell us a little bit about what you do at ClearSlide and how to get in touch if anyone wants to get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to talk about some of these tips today. My contact information is on the screen. Please reach out. I would love to kind of share ideas and learn a little bit more about what you guys are doing. From a ClearSlide perspective, we are the leading sales engagement platform. We really make sure that sales and marketing teams have all the content at their fingertips to be able to communicate out really effectively and have the real-time insights to be able to make smart business decisions. Hopefully your organization is thinking about sales enablement and engagement in this way. And if not, we'd love to be able to help talk to you. Just reach out to ClearSlide.com. We do have a free trial, and look forward to staying in touch.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time and insight, Michael. That was an awesome topic. I loved running through it. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attendance. And good luck, everyone, ramping up the new year.